properties. I'm not exactly sure. We'll see. It'll be a function, I think, in part of, we're actually going to really try and discuss them rather than me just actually kind of saying stuff at you. So we'll kind of see how that goes, and we'll see how many we get through. You know, hopefully it will trigger some interesting conversations. So, and these are building pretty much on the things that you read. So thanks very much for sending me those questions, the answers to those questions. That helped me, as it did last time, to realize A, that I hadn't actually made one of the questions very clear. B, you know, a couple of, I think for the most part everyone seemed to have a good grasp on everything. But if there's any kind of misconceptions, these kind of mini question responses really help me to kind of see that. So thank you for that. So so we're going to talk a little bit about ways in which we can try and understand activation in the brain. It's easy to get activation in the brain. Well, I mean, it requires a big multi-million-dollar machine, but conceptually it's easy to get activation in the brain. But what's much more harder and more interesting is to actually try and figure out, well, you know, what is this activation telling us? Is it telling us anything about mental representations? Is it telling anything about actual information processing, actual mechanisms that are going on? And one of the ways in which we do that is by using these things called classifiers. So I sent, so that's one of the things we're going to try and talk about. We're going to talk a little bit about what classifiers do, what's generalization, what might the brain be doing in generalization, how might you use this for neural decoding, what this might have to do with when you have representations that are kind of overlapping and distributed versus separated or modular, looking at the similarity and what different ways of looking at that are, similarity space. What do we even mean by a representation? This kind of little gap here means if we get time to talk about this thing during this week, these are going to be themes throughout the entire class. So, you know, depending on how the discussion goes, we may get to these now or later. What do we even mean by mechanism? And this next one is probably a little bit more for the undergrads than for the graduate students. That, you know, we were talking last week about what is a question that actually is of interest to you individually about the brain? What would you like to try and find out about it? That might, for instance, be a good basis for your class project. And something that, especially I'm not sure, but I think the undergrads probably haven't had too much experience in yet is actually finding out, you know, well, okay, you have a question about how do you go out there and look for what's known about that. The graduate students kind of do that a lot, so that might be something we could even just a subset of us could look at. So what is a classifier? Now I put this in one of my questions and I realized that actually I hadn't made this really clear enough, and this is what I realized only when the answers came back. What I was really talking about was artificial classifiers. But it is a very reasonable confusion because in fact the brain probably, this is a theory, probably actually in many ways is acting like a classifier itself, or it's certainly performing categorization. So to be, there's actually no very clear distinction between saying, you know, if I say, well, what's classification? Do I mean is that by some artificial algorithm or is that by us? And in fact, the potential parallels between them is actually kind of an interesting topic that we're going to talk about. So so let's actually spend a couple of minutes discussing this. So you know, we did this thing last time of you kind of turn to your neighbors in a little group of 3 or 4, and I want to just kind of bounce the ideas off each other. What are examples of an artificial, in this case, an artificial classifier that you actually interact with in your everyday life? And these days, I can say with some confidence that we do all interact with them in our everyday lives. And I think some of the, the more interesting questions are, what kind of things, for the examples that you and your discussers find, what are the things that they're good at? What are the kind of things that they're not good at? If you want to try and think of instances of the things that they're not good at, just to try and remember last time you got frustrated interacting with a computer, and you'll probably quickly discover something that they're not good at. And why do you think a classifier is actually needed for that problem? So let's spend like 2-3 minutes discussing that, and then we're going to kind of bounce some ideas around the class. So everyone kind of turn to your neighbor or neighbors and talk to them about an example of artificial classifier, what it's good at, what it's not good at, and why you give a good one.
Anything that gets feedback, so then you like this song, these are all similar to that song, so we're going to be discussing times if you like that.
We just have a lot of time to discuss, and I just want to say, like, when it's not good, it's the best possible good. Like, I mean, I do not want you to feel even the tiniest bit kind of reticent about saying, yeah, I wasn't really sure about this. So I'm actually going to start putting that time to the questions. Explicitly, what was something that was unclear, you were sure of, that might be the most important thing. I didn't explicitly ask that, so someone else told me that.
Say I don't want to listen to some song.
I'm going to start asking specific questions.
Well, all I know is that I like this song.
Sorry.
Like,
Okay, well now I feel better.
how much?
So don't feel that much better. Sorry. I'm going to get
Yeah, I know. I can like figure out what it is.
So I said, great, that's wonderful. But I want to make sure I get from all this.
Yeah, like I thought like right, you have to set.
Some kind of music referring to anything.
Yeah, it's a good example.
Or even just more basic than that, categorizing the two different that's a kind of
Yeah, everything. I was gonna say like Netflix with that. Use that. Like, wow, there goes that. No, I was actually
because there is a given up.
General
Have you ever seen that? Yeah. Good comment. That's the other thing.
I usually do like clustered in weird ways, so like everything is figure out which
Well, what we did last week isn't anything that different from what we did. Do you have
it's like just trying to know like putting it like knowing like so like against what actually I was like
it takes a while, like, once you get better with it, there are all these, like, sort of learning curves you hit where it's like, you get over one big thing and then that sort of like, it's really strange, you just learn it and then it sort of like opens all these floodgates. It's like, oh my god, I can do all of this things now. That's always what happened to me over the last year. So like the other day when we were doing all that, a year ago it would have been really difficult for me, but now it's just like, oh yeah.
it becomes like a nature that you use like
You just have like,
instead of the onset of like
yeah, I mean, you know, it's just like, you know, you get like
Okay, so sorry to break into this. So, okay, so what kinds of examples did people come up with? If someone throw out from the discussion you just had, especially if in your discussion someone suggested something to you that you hadn't, that kind of struck you as surprising or that you hadn't thought of. We're just in general. So let's hear a couple of examples of classifiers that you interact with. That's because that's what you guys have just been talking about. Right? Okay. Hey.
I encounter what I think of a classifier as like Pandora.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'm listening.
Good.
I'm listening to music, and it presents a new song, and it says based on like prior feedback of what songs I've liked, it suggests a song because it might be similar in some context.
Yeah, excellent. No, in fact, at least one other person in the email answer mentioned Pandora. Pandora is a very interesting example. Okay, so why do you think a classifier is needed for that problem?
Well, I think it has to have some criteria to use to say, okay, this person liked this song, and this song has certain dimensions about it, which, I mean, I have no idea how they figure out those dimensions. I guess it's kind of, you could say probably other people have said like Netflix, for instance, like movies, and they have these different genres and things like that. But just to impose some kind of structure to say, along some dimension, this song is X, Y, or Z, and then this song is also similar to that song along the same dimension, so let's see if he or she likes it. Okay,
well that's brilliant. That's really very, very illuminating answer, because that really also highlights a couple of important aspects. So you've got these different dimensions. So basically, what a classifier often does is, and I'll show a very toy example in just a minute, but you basically say, okay, there's all this stuff out there in the world, and some of it is, we can measure it along one way, and some we can measure it along another way. So in the case of a song in Pandora, it might be, what's the beats per minute? How fast is it? Or does it tend to be? Or you might have a more abstract dimension, like does it tend to be kind of happy song or a sad song? And so each song will will have a certain score along each of these dimensions. There might be lots and lots of dimensions. It might be how acoustic is it? How which year is it from? There might be lots of different things. And the classifier will try and position these different songs in this kind of big space along those dimensions. So that really kind of highlights some nice example of that. Thank you very much. Great. Another example? Anyone else think? How about an example of a time when one kind of breaks and you're trying to interact with one of these things and it's just not getting you, and it's kind of, because the cases in which they break can actually be quite interesting.
I was going to say like facial recognition software, so a lot of cameras have basic face detection, or Facebook, when you upload a picture, has face detection. And that can kind of break in really interesting ways when it detects faces that aren't actually faces, or fails to detect certain faces.
What are the kinds of things? What are the kind of faces that it would fail to detect?
It always detects me as my twin brother.
That is very
It
interesting.
always tags me as my brother.
And does it tag him as you?
No, actually it doesn't.
Oh, okay. Now, are you guys identical twins?
Yeah.
Do you have like the same kind of facial hair and stuff like this?
No, he doesn't have this.
Oh, okay. That's very interesting. So that's actually a very interesting kind of mistake, because thank you so much, these are great examples. That's a very interesting mistake because it's kind of sort of getting it right? But it's actually also getting it wrong. So there's something quite subtle going on there, right? Like for a classifier to actually break such that it thinks you're your twin brother and it doesn't think you're, I don't know, one of these guys, right? That's doing pretty well. But, presumably the people who you know mostly can tell the difference between you and your twin brother. So that's very interesting. Yeah.
So I was thinking of what kinds of things make it fail. So for example, if we go into the facial recognition thing, then we have to define a face necessarily as maybe 2 eyes and then 1 mouth.
Mm-hmm.
But so that's not actually what a face is.
Right.
So it could fail. So basically, it can fail because our definitions aren't strict enough. So say if someone had a deformed face, then it wouldn't detect it as one, even though it is a face, just because we failed to define that a face could also be these other things.
You raise a very interesting point, although I think actually that the point about having 2 eyes, actually you don't even have to get to deformity. So if you just see someone from the side, right, then you're only seeing one. And in fact, the side views are actually exactly the kind of case which is kind of difficult for face recognition algorithms. Well, sometimes difficult for us. It's usually easier to recognize someone from the front than from the side. But actually, we're kind of pretty amazingly good at recognizing people from the side too. But you're absolutely right, and I think you raised a very, very interesting point that if you were to try and write down a set of rules, there's a whole story to this as well, which we can discuss maybe later. But if you were to try and write down a set of rules saying, here's the rule book for how to recognize a face. Well, rule 1 is going to have 2 eyes. Seems like a very reasonable rule. Okay, it's instantly going to break in a slightly unanticipated sense of when you see someone from the side. So in fact, one of the general cases in which you actually need a classifier for a particular problem, and I think this also will relate to the question of how, what might the brain be doing, maybe, I say maybe because nobody really understands what the brain is doing, is that there's a lot of circumstances, in fact, maybe even almost all circumstances, in which even things that kind of look like you might be able to just write down a nice list of rules saying here's how you do this, it turns out that trying to follow that list of rules is going to get quite broken quite quickly, and there's actually a whole the entire history of artificial intelligence actually kind of ran into that problem in like the 70s and 80s. So it's kind of a whole story in itself. So that's thank you very much. That's a very interesting example. Let's get one more example. I like especially these ones of cases where something breaks, but it doesn't have to be like that. But sometimes that can kind of reveal what's going on underneath a little bit.
Autocorrection. So you're typing some word that is maybe frequent in your own life, like some scientific term or something, and it
Yeah,
doesn't
scientific
recognize
term,
that.
we'll go with that.
Yeah. And corrects it to some other more common word.
Yeah, no, very interesting. Okay, you've probably all seen this website, damnyouautocorrect.com, right? Okay, so so what is an example of the kind of, you don't have to like come up with one of the kind of embarrassing examples from that website, but what is the kind of circumstance in which an autocorrect would kind of get tripped up? Yeah.
Names that are spelled differently. So like
That's a very good example.
I have a friend, her name is spelled Vifaili.
Okay.
And it translated into another name.
Oh,
I'm
okay.
trying to type it in.
Okay, no, that's a very good example. So unusual cases. Okay, so these are great examples. So this is kind of almost a little bit like the example of, trying to say, well, it's easy to recognize a face, for someone with 2 eyes. Well, that kind of works in many circumstances, but there's an unusual case. Actually, not a particularly unusual case in this case of, you see someone from the side, you only see one of their eyes. So similarly, what an autocorrect algorithm is basically trying to do is it's say, what's the most common kinds of words that people tend to type in this circumstance? And that's great if you're saying something, I'm at the store, I'm running late, I'll buy the milk, or something like that. It probably will get that right. But if you're saying, what was your friend's name, Vifali?
Yeah.
Okay, dear Vifali, I don't even know what it would correct it to, but it would, it wouldn't get the right answer because except maybe, and it will eventually, if you keep on kind of hitting the little cross and saying, no, I didn't mean to say, virtual or whatever, I meant to say Vifali, eventually we'll actually learn that. So okay, so that's kind of interesting. So thank you, these are very interesting examples. So what have we gotten from this? So we've gotten that a classifier tries to put a stimulus, see where it is situated along different dimensions, such as the examples of these Pandora music dimensions. In some cases, those dimensions will kind of match with a fairly simple rule. Sometimes you'll be able to describe them, more or less in words, even if it's actually kind of a description that's a little bit hard to unpack, like it's a happy song or it's a sad song, or look for 2 eyes, or correct to a word that's frequently used in the dictionary. And that will usually work quite well, but sometimes it won't. And often the kinds of cases in which you actually do need a classifier at all is for precisely these kind of situations where there isn't really a very good set of rules. It has to do something a little bit different from just finding some rules. It has to do some kind of pattern recognition, and we're going to talk more about what that is. And all of these cases where classifiers break, yeah, please.
Just to sort of poke a little bit, but when would you not want to have an artificial classifier? So it used to be like in medical industry, for example, dermatology. I know RIT was developing this. You wouldn't want to. Well, okay, so RIT was developing supervised like classifications with dermatology to see, maybe is that cancerous, is it not, with assistance from professionals. So now it's okay to have sort of artificial classifiers in the medical industry because it's getting fairly accurate with supervised learning. But is there something where you wouldn't really want to have artificial classifiers?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. Okay, well, I have a thought. Does anyone else have a thought? So, think of an example where you kind of get thrown into a system that's about to kind of subject you to a barrage of classifiers, and sometimes you're just like, no, I don't want this. Yeah.
I feel that way about Siri on my phone.
Oh, yeah, okay.
I'm much more efficient interacting with my phones than like trying to go through this weird interface that doesn't understand what I'm saying at the time, and is like then on top of that interfacing with the actual contents of the phone in a way that I is totally opaque and a complete black box. I don't understand.
No, that's very interesting. I have an iPhone with Siri on it, and I hardly ever use Siri as well. I'll give one example of where I can think of that you probably will recognize from your experience. You call out one of these, you're calling up a bank or something, and you're like, what is your problem today? What would you like to talk about? Is it account balance or something else? And you just like 0, 0, get me to a human being. Right? Now, so this is an example. Okay, this is an example of classifiers and their imperfections. Okay, so I mean, I'm so old that I actually remember when you never used to have any of this kind of stuff. Or at first it would say, press 1 for account balance, press 2 for I don't know, opening hours or something. Okay, but now usually they try and get you actually to say it. Although you can actually often just press the buttons as well. Okay, so what's an example? And this is actually kind of sort of relevant to some of the decoding stuff, neural decoding stuff that we're going to look at. So sometimes these little phone answering systems actually work reasonably well. I mean, if you have a very specific problem, like if you're, if you're calling because, I don't know, you left your credit card in the store yesterday and you're wondering, you left your credit card in the bank branch yesterday and you want to see if anyone found it, they're not going to have an option for that, so you just have to talk to a human being. Okay? But there are some circumstances that actually kind of works okay. So can anyone think of a time where it actually, you're interacting with one of these systems and the voice recognition is usually quite good, and what the circumstances are in which this kind of limited domain in which actually is quite good?
Booking flights, they usually work very well. Booking flights or something.
Okay, interesting. Now what is it, this is very interesting. Okay, so what is it about booking flights that makes them work somewhat better, do you think?
Because, it is a really, certain specified structure. You need to specify where you're going to, depart from, where you're going to arrive, the hours, and all that. So. Okay.
No, very, very good. I like it. So this is actually very, very interesting. So if there's a very, very limited set of answers, okay, and so for instance, if the choice is only arrivals or departures, okay, and all that the system has to do is figure out whatever it is that you're saying into the phone, does it sound a little bit more like arrivals or a little bit more like departures, there's a very good chance it's going to get that right. But if it's the case that there's a whole big world of possible things you might be saying, I'm worried there's a snowstorm and I want to find out, if there's delays in the flights to Philadelphia. Okay? That suddenly goes outside the options, and Classifier is going to have basically no success whatsoever. So it turns out that actually the neural decoding is actually a little bit like that, and we'll get to that. So here's kind of a very, very simple toy example of a classifier, and this is using 2 feature dimensions. So Frank raised this interesting point about different dimensions of music in Pandora. So here's kind of more or less the simplest possible classifier. So you've got weight and you've got height, and you're trying to figure out what sport somebody uses. And one of there's a couple of things that are worth pointing out. One is that one dimension on its own is not actually going to tell you that much. It'll tell you something, but it won't tell you as much as it could do. So if I say to you someone's 7'2", which sport do they play? You'll say, he's probably a basketball player. But if I say, someone's 6'1", what sport do they play? You say, well, I don't know, they're kind of here, somewhere along this axis, they're kind of in the middle. And that single dimension is not sufficient. But if I say, someone is 6'1" and they weigh 500 pounds, then you say, okay, probably a sumo wrestler, not a basketball player. Okay? So it's a combination of information across different dimensions that's actually conveying what you really need to do here. And another thing that's worth pointing out about this is this. I mean, obviously this is just a toy example, but this is kind of 2 extremely widely separated classes. Okay, I'm trying to find 2 sports which are about as far away from each other as they possibly can, 2 basketball players and sumo wrestlers, and life usually isn't like that. Okay, usually the kinds of things that you're trying to figure out are actually much more overlapping. Just as if you're calling a telephone answer system, and it's just trying to figure out if you're saying arrivals or departures. Arrivals and departures are 2 words that sound really quite different from each other. But in most cases, most of them, there's going to be a wider set of things you might be saying, and they might not all sound quite so different from each other. So you'll have much more overlapping distribution. So here's kind of an example of that. So suppose you're trying to figure out, instead of like if somebody is a sumo wrestler or basketball player, you're trying to figure out if someone is student or faculty. Okay. So in general, it's going to be true that faculty are a little bit shorter and a little bit heavier than the students. But it's not going to be completely true, and there's going to be a kind of overlap in these distributions. Okay? And this is how almost everything in life looks like this, okay? With overlapping distributions. And in fact, so this line here, I mean, this is just made up bit, but this line here is kind of more or less sort of a reasonable place to draw the line if you had to draw the line somewhere between these two classes. But this line definitely gets some things wrong. So, in general, the yellow circles are over here, but there's just no way you can possibly draw this line such that you're not going to have some of the green crosses kind of polluting that side. There's going to be, there's overlap in the distribution, and no matter how clever your attempt to carve up the space is going to be, well, maybe, but a simple way of carving up the space is not going to be able to deal with the fact, is not going to be able to unmix this mixture. They're mixed no matter what you do. And then you might say, well, what if I try and do something, we're going to get to this in a minute. What if I try and do something really clever that instead of, clever in inverted commas, because actually it would be a terrible idea. If instead of just drawing a straight line like this, I say, okay, well, I don't want to, have any pollution. I don't want any of my, in this case, class of students to end up on this side of the line. So instead of drawing the line just kind of straight like this, I'm going to have it kind of go, go around this guy, kind of go around this guy, right? And then you might have a perfect line for these particular people that kind of wiggles around and captures them, and it doesn't get anybody on the wrong side of the line. But as you can imagine, that's actually you've trapped yourself into being very, very specific for that particular random set of people who you happen to draw the line wiggling around. So that's called overfitting. That's a failure of generalization. We're going to talk about what generalization is in a minute. So this is the general idea of classifier, and they're becoming more and more common in everyday life, as we just discussed. And one of the main reasons why we use them is because it kind of looks as if the brain sort of does something like this. And this is actually how I unintentionally caused confusion in my question when I said, give an example of a classifier for everyday life, because some people thought I was asking, when the brain acts like a classifier, which is very reasonable because it does in some cases. And other people thought, well, you talking about an artificial classifier, so I really should have said artificial. But an artificial classifier might be trying to recognize speech that somebody says down the phone. When you hit 0 enough times and you get to a real human being, they're trying to recognize speech that you're saying down the phone too, right? They just happen to be much, much, much better at it than the computer system. Now, are they doing the same kind of thing as the computer system? Maybe, maybe not. That's actually a very, very interesting question. Nobody really knows the answer to that, but we're going to talk about that a little bit. So we're going to talk a little bit about applying classifiers to fMRI, why you would possibly want to do such a thing, and what kind of questions it opens up if you do that. And one of the articles that you guys read was this nice review by Norman Nadal. Jim Haxby is one of the authors on it, from Trends in Cognitive Sciences. And I just want to, I don't think we're going to do that in today's class, but one thing that we're going to do soon is actually, especially more for the undergraduates, look a little bit into, given a particular question that you're interested in, how can you find out, kind of what's known about it, what isn't known about it, because this would be a good basis for you to do a class project. Like even one option will be to, take an existing data set and do an analysis of it, which I think would be interesting. But another option would be, take a question and kind of write a, like if you like, a pretend grant proposal saying, or pretend experimental design, which, hey, might even turn into a real experiment if it's interesting, saying, here's how I would address this question. And one of the first things you've got to figure out then is, well, hang on a minute, what's actually known about this and what isn't known about this? And looking for that, searching for that can be an interesting activity. Anyway, a very, very good, when you do start doing that kind of search, the first thing you'll discover is that it's overwhelming that there's just so much stuff out there. How is it possible that there's so many articles and we still don't know how the brain works? Or, if you go to the Society for Neuroscience conference, it has 30,000 people out there every single year. We still don't know how the brain works. So there's a huge amount of stuff out there, and fortunately for us, there do exist these very nice, they have their imperfections, but they're kind of good guidelines, kind of short review articles that are usually written by people who are very, kind of eminent in the field that basically say, here's kind of what we know about this right now. And often they even have little boxes saying, here's what the open questions. Now, that's the open, what those authors think are the open questions, but it's a guideline. It's a way of kind of navigating through this jungle a little bit. And Trends in Cognitive Sciences happens to be a particularly nice journal for that. So anyway, so that was more for the benefit of undergraduates. But if you're hunting around for, what do we know about a certain topic, looking for these kind of short review articles is a good place to start. And I'm trying in the readings to kind of concentrate on these kind of review articles, because I think you get a lot of information from them. Okay, so this is kind of an example of a neural decoding, and this actually is using some of the examples of the stimuli from one of the other papers that we wrote, which is the Haxby 2001 paper. Is this kind of visible from most parts of the room? It's probably a little fuzzy. Okay, so this actually reflects a lot of the stuff that we just talked about. So in this case, instead of trying to figure out, did I just say arrivals or departures, it's trying to figure out, is there some pattern of brain activation that I'm seeing that corresponds to the pattern when people are looking at, in this case, a bottle, or when they're looking at a shoe. There were actually 8 different categories in the Haxby paper: bottles, shoes, faces, houses, stuff like that. So we also talked about features. So in the case of Pandora music, the features were, how many beats per minute of the song have? Is it happy or slow? Is it acoustic or electric? Is it, from the 60s or the 70s? In this case, and there could be lots and lots of those dimensions. In this case, the features are, what's the activation in this voxel? What's the activation in that voxel? What's the activation in the next voxel? And so that's like this little kind of V1 to Vn up here. And that might be across hundreds, that might be across thousands of voxels. In fact, when you take a typical MRI image of the brain, it will probably have at least 20,000 voxels. So you have a lot of features. Now, not all of them may contain information that you care about, but there'll be a lot of different features. So, so then what you do is you say, well, let's try and figure out from those features which pattern I have. Now, remember how in fMRI it usually goes the other way around. So usually you say, if you were just doing essentially a kind of what lit up type experiment, you would say, let's show someone a shoe, let's see what lights up. Let's show, and by lighting up, it's actually shorthand for, which are areas in which levels of blood oxygenation increase in the brain. There's not actually literally something lighting up. I show someone a bottle, see which areas light up. I show someone a shoe, which areas light up, and I get activation patterns for each of them. So this is kind of trying to go the other way around. So it says, from those activation patterns, can I figure out if it was a bottle or if it was a shoe? So each activation pattern is obviously just, kind of 3D lump of voxels. You might select them from your favorite part of the brain, in this case, ventral temporal cortex, which is kind of quite sensitive to objects. And typically, in order to enter them into one of these algorithms, you don't really kind of treat them as like a shaped 3D lump anymore. You just say it's just a bunch of numbers. Okay, so I'm just going to stretch them into a row. I've just got a list of numbers now, and that's you remember in the computer practical last week. Those of you who were here for that, we were looking at we looked at the time course from a particular voxel, and that was the vector, which basically just means it's just a list of numbers. So that's what you would take for these. You would say, okay, I've got a bunch of activations across these voxels. I'm going to stretch them out into a list of numbers, and then I'm going to say, well, some of these have particular patterns. So you can see in this case, it kind of looks like for the bottles, there seems to be, these voxels seem to be quite active, and these ones less so. And for the shoes, it kind of looks a little bit like the other way around. You seem to have more activation maybe in these voxels here. And then this is interesting thing that happens here of, I don't know if you can read this from that, it says it's divided into a training set and a test set. So what's that about? Well, remember how we talked about the example of, if I want to divide faculty from students here, I can do an absolutely perfect, seemingly perfect job by, instead of drawing a straight line, drawing this kind of little wiggly line that goes all around all of the little crosses here. But that's not going to do very well in general. So so how can you guard against that? Make sure you don't do that by mistake. You can say, I'm not going to try and fit my line to every single piece of data that I happen to have right now. I'm going to just use some of it. And if I can use just some of it and it works for the rest of it, then I must be capturing something kind of fairly real and underlying in the data, and I haven't just gotten tripped up by some kind of arbitrary aspects of this particular data point or that particular data point. And so that's what this is called, the jargon term for that is cross-validation, but that's what this idea is here, that you say, don't try and fit absolutely every single thing you possibly can. Just take some of it. We're going to call that the training set. Try and fit to that. If you've done an okay job, then whatever you've just fitted to will work reasonably well on the rest of it. It's called a test set. So that's a way of checking that you can generalize. I'm going to give an example, talk more about generalization in a second. But generalization basically just means making sure that you're trying to capture something that's real in the data and it's not just some kind of idiosyncratic specifics, that what works for this is going to work for other stuff too. So you say, okay, well, it looks to me like the bottles are producing more activation in these voxels, and the shoes are producing more activation in these voxels. So now you have something from your test set that's going to say, okay, well, how good is your model actually? How well is it doing? And then you say, okay, here's some activation. Do I think, here's a vector, just a list of numbers. Do I think it came from a bottle, or do I think it came from a shoe? And what the classifier in effect is doing is just like in this example of kind of height and weight space. It's taking an example in voxel in this dimension. Each voxel is one dimension now. So it's only showing two here, but you actually have lots of them. Saying, okay, well, in general, the shoes are kind of down here, and the bottles are kind of over here. So if my test point is kind of more on this side, I'm going to say, oh, I think it's a bottle. If my test point is more on this side, then I think it's a shoe. And this is not a location in physical space. This is not a part of the brain. This is a position in this kind of activation space where each dimension is different voxel. Yeah.
Is this done offline or online? Like, is the basically this feature detection or test set within the warping algorithm? Or do you get all that data first and then go through and sort? Because when we do single unit, I record everything, and then I go on and I try to do pattern detection, and I say it's complete rubbish, and then I try to go and I find my own cells through it.
That is a very, very good question. So, and just to kind of clarify for people, by online you basically mean kind of are you doing this while you're getting the data? Yeah. And offline you mean first of all you get all the data, and then you kind of say, okay, now I'm done, now I'm going to kind of churn through it.
Yeah.
Okay. So usually, this is a very, very good question. In fact, I haven't set any of this stuff as readings for later, but it could be something we could look at, or it could actually be an interesting thing to do a project on. But so typically, what you do is you collect all the data, and then you go home, get some sleep, and then try and analyze it. But there actually is another way of doing it, which is called real-time fMRI. Which kind of, as the name indicates, you're actually trying to kind of have the analysis happen so quickly that it actually gets done while you're collecting the data. And as you can, it requires a little bit more kind of, fancy, fast computing, pumping the data out and correcting, doing stuff. It requires some kind of fast churning for that to happen. But there's a nice, the nice result of that is you can get people, for instance, to actually see some representation of their own brain activation while it's happening. So the people use this, for instance, in things like pain.
Yeah.
You say, I'm going to show you this thermometer on the screen, which is kind of an indication of how much activation is happening right now, or even a pattern. People do this for pattern recognition too. The degree to which the pattern of activation in your brain right now kind of looks pain-like. Try and make this thermometer kind of go down. People are like, well, I don't have any ability to control patterns of activation in my brain. I don't know how to make the thermometer go down. And then experiments, just kind of do random stuff and just see if anything starts to make the thermometer go down. Just do more of that. And amazingly, it actually kind of sort of works. But that's actually very kind of people are working on that right now. That's very kind of new and somewhat untested.
But I mean, aside from neural feedback responses, when you're actually collecting the data, are you saying that you collect every single voxel you can in an entire brain, and you collect all of that data, and none of it is sorted from the get-go?
Usually, well, there's different ways of doing it, but typically, you know, the easiest thing to do is usually collect a whole brain full of data and then kind of sort through it afterwards.
Okay.
But you don't have to do that. You can if you know, if you're pretty sure you know in advance exactly, you know, you just want to care about a particular part of the brain, you can actually concentrate and just like, you know, in neurophysiology, you can say, we're just going to record from this tape. You can actually collect just from a subpart of the brain too, and you know, the advantage of that is you might be able to get the data more quickly, for instance.
Okay.
But the disadvantage is, well, you know, what if something interesting is happening where you didn't look? And so, okay, so this is the general idea of neural decoding. This is just a cartoon slide, but this is kind of an important slide for kind of a lot of the ideas we're going to be talking about in this class. So, first of all, I would not be in the tiniest bit surprised if not everything here is clear. And second of all, do not feel in the tiniest bit reticent about asking if something isn't clear. And if you do feel reticent, you can always post like an anonymous question on PS or something like that. So do not for 1 minute worry if, you know, not absolutely everything in this is clear to you, because we're going to spend a lot of the class kind of unpacking what might be going on here. So let's talk a little bit more about generalization, because this is kind of important, because the brain can generalize and classifiers can generalize. They may or may not be doing the same thing. So so here's the example of generalization. I just kind of zoomed in on the bottom of that here. So here the example of generalization is, you know, the classifier's trying to figure out what activation looks kind of like the stuff that happens in general when people see shoes, in this particular instance, and what activation looks like the stuff in general that happens when people see bottles in this instance. And just like with, you know, the students first faculty, you know, pretty okay way to start is just say, I'm just going to draw some line through the space. I accept that there's going to be some overlap between these distributions, but I'm just going to draw a line and say, as far as I'm concerned, I'm going to call everything on one side of the line a bottle, everything on the other side of the line a shoe. So you've only seen, the classifier in this case has only seen, you know, a finite number of brain images from bottles and shoes. But armed with that small number of things that it's seen, it has to be able to handle anything you can throw at it and say, okay, you know, I gave you 50 examples for training, but now here's one you've never seen before. What do you think of this? So that's generalization. So the classifier basically says, well, I'm just going to say, you know, whatever it seems to match best to, according to my simple rule, my simple decision line that I just drew, whichever side of that I think it lies on, that's what I'm going to say. So it's kind of how easy it is to see these dots here. The dark dots kind of represent the data that the classifier is actually seeing, what it's been trained on, and then the ones with the little rings are kind of some of the test examples. So the generalization is, it says that you know, everything that's kind of similar to what I've already seen of one category, I'm going to say, yeah, that belongs to that category. So everything that's kind of similar to the shoe activations, I'm going to say is a shoe, and that's my generalization. You can give me something new, and I'm going to put it in this space of, you know, activation along this voxel, activation along that voxel. There's actually going to be lots of voxels, not just